In 1899, a portrait was painted in the quiet town of Ashford, Massachusetts. The painting showed a woman named Sienna Blackwell. She sat stiffly in a high-backed chair, her hands folded in her lap. Her dress was dark and plain. Her expression gave nothing away. The background was a muted brown, featureless and dull. For decades, this portrait hung in the storage rooms of the Ashford Regional Museum. It was one painting among thousands. There was nothing about it that caught the eye. It looked like every other provincial portrait from that era. Competent but uninspired. A technical exercise, nothing more. The museum had acquired the painting in 1947. It came from the estate of the Hartwell family, distant relatives of the woman in the portrait. The donation papers listed the artist as Walker Chambers, a minor painter who had worked in the region during the late 19th century. The records described the piece as a standard commissioned portrait. It was catalogued, photographed, and stored in a climate-controlled room. For over 70 years, it remained untouched. Museum staff walked past it countless times. Researchers occasionally pulled it from the racks to study other paintings nearby, but no one gave it more than a passing glance. Then, in the spring of 2018, the museum began a long-delayed conservation project. Budget constraints and staffing issues had pushed routine maintenance back for years. Now, with fresh funding, dozens of paintings from storage were scheduled for routine cleaning and assessment. The Blackwell portrait was assigned to Jonathan Reeves, the museum's lead conservator. Jonathan had worked at the museum for 15 years. He had cleaned and restored hundreds of paintings. He knew what to expect from 19th-century provincial portraits. They were usually straightforward: grimy surfaces, yellowed varnish, sometimes minor damage from improper storage. But the paintings themselves were rarely surprising. The Blackwell portrait was not a priority piece. It was listed as low importance in the conservation schedule. Jonathan expected the work to be straightforward: remove the grime, clean the yellowed varnish, document the condition, move on to the next painting. He estimated it would take 2 or 3 days at most, but when Jonathan looked closer, he found something impossible. The discovery happened on a Tuesday morning in late April. The weather outside was gray and drizzling. Jonathan had set up the painting on his workbench in the conservation studio. The studio was on the second floor of the museum, a bright room with tall windows and specialized lighting. He positioned the portrait under his work lights and examined it carefully. The canvas was dirty. Decades of dust had settled into the surface. The varnish had yellowed significantly, giving the whole painting a dull, amber tone. Jonathan began with the face, working carefully with a cotton swab and a mild solvent. The varnish came away slowly, revealing the paint beneath. The technique was ordinary. The brushwork was competent but flat. The artist had followed academic conventions. The skin tones were built up in layers, but they lacked depth. The modeling was adequate but uninspired. The whole painting seemed lifeless. Jonathan had seen hundreds of portraits just like it. Then he reached the eyes. Jonathan used a magnifying lens for detail work. It was standard practice when cleaning delicate areas like eyes and mouths. As he cleaned around the left eye, working gently with a fresh swab, he noticed something unusual. The pupil was not just black paint. Under magnification, he could see tiny, glittering flecks suspended in the dark surface. They caught the light like metal shavings or crushed glass. The effect was startling. The rest of the painting was dull and conventional, but the eyes seemed almost alive. They seemed to shimmer. Jonathan paused. He leaned closer. He adjusted the magnification. The flecks were definitely there. They were evenly distributed throughout the black paint of the pupil. They were not on the surface. They were embedded in the paint itself. He moved to the right eye. The same thing. Microscopic particles, glittering in the black paint of the pupil. Both eyes had been treated with the same technique. Jonathan had cleaned hundreds of 19th-century portraits. He had worked on paintings from all over New England. He had never seen anything like this. He documented the discovery with photographs. Then he called Leonardo Vance, the museum's curator, to his studio. Leonardo arrived within the hour. He was a tall man in his 50s with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He had curated the museum's collection for over 20 years. He examined the painting under the lens, moving from one eye to the other. He was puzzled. His first thought was damage. Perhaps the painting had been repaired at some point, and someone had used an inappropriate material. Amateur repairs sometimes introduced foreign substances into old paintings. But as he looked closer, he realized the work was too precise. The particles were evenly distributed throughout both pupils. The application was controlled and deliberate. This was not damage. This was not a clumsy repair. This was intentional technique. Leonardo stepped back from the workbench. He looked at the painting as a whole, then back at the magnified view of the eyes. The contrast was striking. The rest of the portrait was utterly conventional. But the eyes were something else entirely. He suggested bringing in an art historian, someone who specialized in 19th-century American painting, someone who might be able to explain what they were seeing. Within a week, Everett Chase arrived from Boston. Everett was a professor at a small liberal arts college. He specialized in American regional art of the 19th century, particularly lesser-known provincial painters. He had published several papers on New England portrait painters. Leonardo had worked with him before on attribution questions. Everett spent 2 days at the museum. He examined the painting under various lighting conditions. He studied it under magnification. He reviewed the museum's records, reading through the donation papers and the original catalog entry. He searched for any mention of unusual techniques or materials. The facts were straightforward. Walker Chambers had been born in Ashford in 1861. He was the son of a local merchant. He showed artistic talent early, and his family sent him to Boston in 1879 to study at a small private academy. He trained there for 2 years, learning the academic style of portrait painting. Then he returned home to work as a portrait and landscape painter. He took commissions from local families. He painted views of the countryside. He made a modest living. He was competent, but not exceptional. His work was conventional. He painted what his clients wanted. He did not experiment. He did not innovate. There were no records of experimental techniques. No evidence of unusual materials or methods. No mention of photography or scientific interests. Walker Chambers appeared to have been a straightforward craftsman. He died in 1903 at the age of 42. The cause of death was listed as pneumonia. He left behind approximately 60 known paintings, all of them conventional portraits or landscapes. Everett explained the context. In 1899, the art world was changing rapidly. Photography had disrupted traditional painting. Some artists saw photography as a threat. Others saw it as an opportunity. The Impressionists were capturing light and movement in ways that photography could not. The Realists were pushing technical precision to new limits, competing with the camera's accuracy. But what Walker Chambers had done was different. This was not Impressionism. This was not realism in the traditional sense. This looked like an attempt to merge photography with paint, to embed photographic materials into the canvas itself, to create a hybrid medium. But why? And how? And why was there no record of it? The museum decided to pursue a scientific analysis. They needed to know exactly what those glittering particles were. Leonardo contacted several specialists. In early July, they contracted Magnolia Frost, a forensic imaging specialist who worked with museums and law enforcement. Magnolia had helped authenticate paintings, detect forgeries, and analyze historical artworks. She had access to sophisticated equipment that could identify materials without damaging the painting. Magnolia brought her equipment to Ashford on a hot July afternoon. She set up in the conservation studio, covering the windows to control the light. Her primary tool was an X-ray fluorescence scanner. a handheld device that could identify the chemical elements in paint. The technique was non-invasive. It worked by exposing small areas of the painting to X-rays and measuring the fluorescent response. Each element in the periodic table produces a unique fluorescent signature. By scanning the painting systematically, she could create a chemical map of the entire surface. She started with the main areas of the portrait. The scanner was passed slowly over the canvas, measuring point by point. The data appeared on her laptop screen as colored maps, each color representing a different element. The main palette was typical for the period: lead white for the highlights, zinc white for the lighter tones, yellow and red ochres for the skin, bone black for the shadows, traces of cobalt in the background. All standard pigments used by artists in the 1890s. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place. Then Magnolia scanned the eyes. The results appeared on the screen. For a moment, she said nothing. She stared at the data. Then she ran the scan again, checking for errors. The results were the same. The microscopic flecks were not paint. They were particles of silver. Suspended silver compounds. The chemical signature matched silver halides, the light-sensitive materials used in early photography. Silver bromide or silver iodide, the same chemicals that made photographic plates sensitive to light. Walker Chambers had somehow embedded photographic chemicals directly into the wet oil paint of the pupils. Magnolia looked up from her laptop. She called Jonathan and Leonardo over. She showed them the scans. The silver signal was unmistakable. It was concentrated entirely in the pupils, nowhere else in the painting. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. This hybrid technique was not documented in any art history text. It was not mentioned in any manual or treatise from the period. Magnolia had worked with hundreds of 19th-century paintings. She had never seen anything like this. Everett confirmed that he had never encountered or read about such a technique. It appeared to be a private experiment, a unique innovation. But why would a conventional portrait painter attempt something so bizarre, and why only in the eyes? Why not use the technique throughout the painting? The investigation shifted. The question was no longer what had been done. The question was why. And to answer that question, they needed to know more about the people involved, about Walker Chambers, and about Sienna Blackwell, the woman in the portrait. Everett began researching Sienna Blackwell. The museum's records provided only basic information. She had lived in Ashford. She had been painted by Walker Chambers in 1899. She had died in 1901 at the age of 34. The cause of death was listed as consumption, what we now call tuberculosis. But there were no details about her life, no explanation for why her portrait had been painted with such an unusual technique, no indication of what made her special. The museum assigned Charlie Thorne, their archivist, to search for more information. Charlie was a meticulous researcher. He combed through the donation files looking for anything that might have been overlooked. He searched local newspapers from the 1890s and early 1900s. He contacted the Ashford Historical Society. He looked through church records, census data, and property records. For weeks, he found nothing. Sienna Blackwell appeared in the census of 1900. She was listed as unmarried, living alone, occupation unspecified. There were no news articles about her, no obituary, no mention in local histories. She seemed to have left almost no trace. Then, in late August, Charlie discovered something unexpected. He was reviewing the original donation files for the third time, making sure nothing had been missed. Tucked inside the folder, behind the formal donation agreement, was a folded piece of paper. It was yellowed and brittle. Charlie opened it carefully. It was a diary entry, handwritten in faded blue ink. It was dated April 1947. The author was Eliana Hartwell, the woman who had donated the painting to the museum. She had written it as a personal note to accompany the donation. It had been filed with the paperwork but never read carefully, never transcribed, never added to the official record. Charlie read it slowly. Then he called Leonardo. The entry described Sienna Blackwell. She was not just a local woman. She was a figure of fascination in Ashford during the 1890s. She was a spiritualist, a medium, a woman who claimed to see visions that others could not. She held seances in her home on Maple Street. She spoke to the dead. She described otherworldly landscapes and distant realms. She claimed to see things beyond the physical world. People came from neighboring towns to consult her. Some believed she was genuine. Others thought she was a fraud. But everyone agreed she was compelling. The diary mentioned Walker Chambers. He had been commissioned to paint her portrait in the spring of 1899. The commission had come from a local society of spiritualists who wanted a formal portrait of their most prominent member. But the commission had changed him. Eliana wrote that her grandmother, who had known both Sienna and Walker, described the artist as becoming obsessed. He attended Sienna's seances. He sat in her parlor and listened to her describe her visions. She spoke of strange landscapes, of skies that were not blue, of trees that grew in impossible directions, of horizons that curved wrong. Walker became convinced that her eyes held a power. He believed that she truly saw things beyond the physical world. He believed that her visions were real, and he became determined to capture them. Not just her likeness, not just the appearance of her eyes. He wanted to capture the visions themselves. He wanted to fix her spiritual sight to the canvas, just as a photograph fixed an image to a plate. According to the diary, Walker spent weeks researching photography. He visited a photographic studio in Boston. He studied the chemistry of the process. He experimented with ways to combine photographic materials with oil paint. The diary did not describe his exact methods, but it suggested he worked in secret in his studio, trying to achieve something that had never been done before. The diary was brief and fragmentary. It was a second-hand account, written decades after the events, but it provided the missing context. Walker Chambers had not been experimenting with technique for its own sake. He had been trying to achieve something impossible. He had been trying to make a portrait that was more than a portrait, a painting that held not just an image, but a vision, a spiritual reality captured in paint and silver. The evidence pointed to a strange fusion of art, science, and spiritualism. But there was still one more test to be done, one final analysis that might reveal what Walker had truly achieved. In September, Magnolia returned to Ashford with different equipment. She would use high-resolution infrared reflectography, a technique designed to see beneath the surface of a painting. Infrared light penetrates layers of paint and varnish. It reveals underdrawings, corrections, and hidden details that are invisible to the naked eye. Artists often sketch their compositions in charcoal or thin paint before adding the final layers. Infrared can reveal these preliminary sketches, showing how the artist planned and revised their work. The scan was performed on a Friday afternoon. The conservation studio was cleared of unnecessary equipment. The painting was positioned in front of the infrared camera, a large, specialized device mounted on a tripod. The lights were dimmed. The camera captured the surface layer by layer, building a composite image of what lay beneath the visible paint. The process took over 2 hours. When the results appeared on the monitor, everyone in the room went silent. Underneath the paint of the pupils, hidden by the silver particles, Walker Chambers had painted something else. 2 microscopic landscapes. They were not reflections of the room. They were not studies from life. They appeared to be imaginative scenes, otherworldly vistas, strange, distorted horizons. One showed twisted trees against a sky that seemed to curve inward. The other showed a landscape that appeared to slope upward in impossible directions. The visions Sienna Blackwell had described. Jonathan leaned closer to the monitor. The detail was extraordinary. Each landscape was no larger than a pinhead. The brushwork was impossibly fine. Walker must have used brushes with only a few hairs. He had painted these tiny scenes first, working under magnification. Then he had layered the silver particles over them. Then he had added the black paint of the pupil on top. The landscapes were sealed inside the eye, hidden, embedded, captured. The findings were compiled into a detailed report. Everett wrote the historical analysis, placing Walker's work in the context of late 19th-century spiritualism and the influence of photography on painting. Magnolia provided the technical data, documenting the materials and techniques. Jonathan documented the conservation process and the discovery itself. The report was reviewed by the museum's board in October. The conclusion was clear. Walker Chambers had not been a simple portrait painter. He had been an experimenter. A man caught up in the spiritualist fervor of the late 19th century. A man who believed that art could do more than represent reality. It could capture the unseen. It could make the invisible visible. The plainness of the portrait had been deliberate. The stiff pose, the dark dress, the lifeless brushwork, the dull background. It was all a shell, a mundane vessel designed to house something extraordinary. The silver particles were an attempt to fix Sienna's visions to the canvas, just as they fixed light in a photograph. The microscopic landscapes were the visions themselves, sealed forever inside her painted gaze. The painting was recontextualized. It was no longer catalogued as a standard provincial portrait. It was classified as a unique artifact, a hybrid work that blurred the boundaries between painting, photography, and occult practice. Summer Hayes, the museum's director, approved its transfer from storage to a new exhibition space. The exhibition opened in November 2018. The portrait of Sienna Blackwell was displayed in a small, dimly lit gallery on the museum's main floor. A detailed placard explained its history and the discovery of its hidden elements. Visitors could view the painting under normal light and then examine magnified images of the eyes and the hidden landscapes on a nearby monitor. Digital microscopy allowed people to see details that would have been impossible to perceive with the naked eye. The exhibition was titled Captured Sight. The story attracted attention beyond Ashford. Art journals published articles about the discovery. Historians debated the implications. Some argued that Walker Chambers had been ahead of his time, anticipating the multimedia experiments of the 20th century. Others saw the painting as a cautionary tale about the dangers of obsession and the blurred lines between art and delusion. But the most striking detail was this. For over a century, the portrait had been dismissed as plain and unremarkable. It had been stored, forgotten, and ignored. Thousands of people had access to it. Museum staff had walked past it. Researchers had pulled it from the racks. But no one had looked closely at the eyes. No one had questioned the technique. The secret had been hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice. Alana Morton, a visiting researcher who studied the painting in early 2019, summed it up in her notes. She wrote that the portrait was a reminder that history is not always visible, that meaning is not always obvious, that the past holds countless secrets, waiting for someone to look closer. She wrote that every archive, every storage room, every forgotten collection might contain similar discoveries. Objects dismissed as ordinary might be extraordinary. The challenge is knowing where to look, and having the patience to look closely. The Ashford Regional Museum continues to display the portrait of Sienna Blackwell. It remains one of their most popular pieces. Visitors stand in front of it, studying the eyes, trying to see what Walker Chambers saw, trying to glimpse the visions he captured. Children press close to the monitor, fascinated by the tiny hidden worlds. Adults read the placard, absorbing the strange story of obsession and belief. The painting is no longer plain. It is no longer unremarkable. It is a testament to a hidden obsession. A strange fusion of art and belief. A window into a world where artists sought not just to paint what they saw, but to capture what could not be seen. And it raises a question that lingers. How many other paintings are waiting in storage rooms and archives, holding secrets that no one has yet discovered. How many other artists hid their obsessions in their work, embedding meanings and visions that remain invisible? How many objects sit in museum basements, dismissed as ordinary, waiting for someone to finally notice what makes them extraordinary? The portrait of Sienna Blackwell suggests that the answer is many, that history is full of hidden layers, that the past is never as simple as it first appears, and that sometimes all it takes is one person looking closer to change everything we thought we knew. One conservator cleaning a forgotten painting, one archivist reading an old letter, one researcher asking the right question. The past is waiting. The secrets are there. They just need to be seen.